I want to try to walk through Chapter 10 with you. We need to discuss this aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. What we're doing here is using something similar to what we learned in microeconomics with a supply-demand chart. And if you remember from microeconomics, quantity was on the horizontal axis, price was on the vertical axis, supply moved from the left-hand bottom up to the right-hand top. Demand was downward sloping. Where the two met was equilibrium, and that was how we dealt with understanding what a firm faced in the market. Here we're trying to create, using the same model, an idea that will explain business cycles to us. And on the axis at the bottom on the right here, we use GDP. That is the output. Instead of quantity like we used in microeconomics, we use GDP. It is the total output of the economy. And on this side, we have what's called the price level. And that is a number that takes prices, compares them to a particular base year. Now, what we need to understand then is, well, what makes supply and demand move? What makes them shift? And the supply side of this is this first figure shows that there is a potential GDP right here. That would be known as the long run average supply. In the long run, you'll come back to or go up to full employment, and that's when you will achieve the potential GDP. That line right there, the vertical line, is long run average supply. But in the short term, you could have supply shifts in the short term that move back and forth due to some factors. We need to discuss those factors. So one of those factors is that whenever the potential GDP moves, the short-term supply is automatically moved. That's what this figure shows here. The potential GDP has moved to here, and that caused a new supply curve to be created in the short term. So whenever long-term supply shifts, short-term supply also shifts. So the long-run aggregate supply is the potential GDP, and it increases if there is an increase in the full employment quantity of labor. If that increases. It also increases with productivity increases. Productivity increases when the quantity of capital increases or technology advances. So we talked about this in an earlier video. What moves potential GDP is one of two things, either a productivity improvement, which comes about through capital investment, or through advanced technology. We come up with a way to get more done with less resources, or it comes about when the quantity of capital is increased. Capital is our way of buying machinery that's more advanced and gives us the ability to make more with less. So productivity improvement is the only way to increase the potential GDP or move the long-run aggregate supply to the positive direction. So that's one of the things that drives short-run average supply. But it also shifts when the price of the factors of production, especially the money wage rate, changes. The money wage rate changes due to the fluctuations from full employment and expectations of inflation. Okay, so when people expect inflation, they look for increased wages, and companies, in order to keep them employed, have to raise their wages in order to allay their fear of inflation eating their paycheck. All right, and the other one is the fluctuations from full employment. There are times when we actually can get above full employment, and that would cause the wage rate to increase. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Here's an example of the short-run supply shifting back because the real wage rate increases and moves us back to the potential GDP and full employment. Okay, so you can get past full employment. Full employment means that you have part-time workers and full-time workers working all they want to work. Everyone who wants to work is working, either in a full-time or a part-time job. you can go past full employment. Part-time workers can work more hours, full-time workers can work overtime, so you can get past full employment. But if you have a sustained period past full employment, you've got a resource scarcity. Labor is harder to hire, so companies must raise their wages in order to get people to come and work for them and stay working for them. Once that happens, their costs increase and their supply shifts back, and they end up back at the potential GDP and full employment. Okay, now we need to talk about aggregate demand. It's a downward sloping curve, just like it was in microeconomics. What makes it shift back and forth? Expectations. Expectations of future prices. Expected inflation motivates consumers to spend more money. When I think prices are going up, I spend money now to avoid paying a higher price later. If I expect to get future income, an increase in my job or wages, anything that makes me think that I'm going to make more money in the future will motivate me to spend money now. And for a firm, if I think profits are going to be good in the next few years, I'm motivated to spend more money. So that will cause aggregate demand to shift. But also the government gets involved. Fiscal policy, that's the government spending money. If the government starts spending money, it will increase aggregate demand. Monetary policy, if the Fed keeps interest rates low, if they do the quantitative easing as they are, they're going to drive aggregate demand up. So that's what makes things like aggregate demand and supply change, okay? So we have an example down here where we were at full employment and potential GDP, we were at equilibrium, and we had an increase in the aggregate demand. Something happened to cause the aggregate demand increase. It would be one of these things up here. When that happens, we now have our labor force beyond full employment. So we got part-time workers working more hours, full-time workers working overtime. Companies are really heating up. They're looking for people to work for them. They have to pay more wages in order to get them to stay with them and hire new people. So what happens is when those wages start to increase, it causes the supply curve to shift to the left. You'll end up back at full employment at a higher price level. So being in this area right in here, this area here is inflationary. It drives you back to full employment, okay? Likewise, you could have a demand curve that's down here, so your equilibrium point is below full employment. And what happens is the real wage rate then declines, and it starts to lower costs, which allows the supply to shift in another direction, and when the supply shifts in the other direction, we then get back to full employment working this way. That is a recessionary gap. This is an inflationary gap around the potential GDP. This all ties into this chart that I showed earlier to you, which is here's the potential GDP per person, the black line, and here's the red line, which is our actual real GDP per person in this country. And you can see that we bounce around the full employment line, the potential GDP line. We bounce around from it. We're about as far away from it now as we've ever been. We are under full employment by a lot. Unemployment's very high. Something will happen that will bring us back to potential GDP. But we're still waiting. We know that the Fed's doing their part. The government's spending a lot of money. Hopefully, with the Fed printing money and the government spending money, and businesses starting to see that they have a future for potential profits, and employees feeling more comfortable that their incomes are going to be okay. There'll be more spending. That'll increase aggregate demand. That will drive us over towards full unemployment. So that's how the business cycles work using the aggregate demand, aggregate supply curves. And you can see that it holds true that we do bounce around from around the potential GDP line. Okay? Hopefully we'll get back in the future. So at least we now know some of the things that have to happen to get us back there. So I hope this has helped you understand Chapter 10 a little bit better, and you can bring questions to the forum. Thank you.